The cold came first. Not the kind that nips at your skin or makes you shiver, but the kind that settles into your bones and refuses to leave. The kind that turns breath into smoke and silence into something heavy enough to feel. Elias Rowan woke before dawn, his eyes snapping open to a darkness so complete it felt solid. No stars, no moon. Just black pressing in from every side. His blanket was stiff with frost, and the ground beneath him felt like iron. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the ache in his shoulders, the ache in his hands, and the deep bite of cold reminded him. He was alone in the high country, and winter was coming fast. The fire beside him had burned down to dull red coals. He pushed himself upright, breath fogging the air, and stretched stiff fingers toward the dying heat. Somewhere far off, wind whispered through the pines, carrying the warning of a coming storm. This place had no mercy for hesitation. Either you worked or you froze. Elias rose slowly, joints stiff from sleeping on bare earth. The ground beneath him was frozen hard, his bed nothing more than pine boughs and a thin blanket. He had slept like this for weeks now. Every bone in his body protested, but he pushed the pain aside. Pain was familiar. Weakness was not allowed. He stood and looked out over the clearing he had chosen days before. It wasn't much yet, just a rough patch carved out of forest, but to him it was possibility. Survival, a chance. The first light of dawn crept through the trees, revealing towering pines dusted with frost. Somewhere in the distance, wind moaned through the mountains like a warning. Elias pulled his coat tighter and stepped toward the center of the clearing, boots crunching softly against frozen earth. This place would be his shelter or his grave. He reached for his axe where it leaned against a stump. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, the head nicked and scarred. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his lifeline. He lifted it, feeling the familiar weight settle into his hands, grounding him. The first tree he chose stood tall and straight, its trunk thick and straight as a pillar. A good tree, a necessary one. He rested his forehead against the bark for a moment, breath fogging the air, then stepped back and raised the axe. The first strike echoed through the trees with a sharp, hollow crack. Again, and again. Each swing sent a jolt through his arms, up into his shoulders, rattling his teeth. Chips of pale wood flew into the snow. The sound carried far, breaking the stillness of the forest like a warning bell. Somewhere unseen, birds lifted into the sky. He worked steadily, breath falling into rhythm with the swing of the axe. The cold bit through his gloves. His muscles burned. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. The tree groaned a low, aching sound as the cut deepened. Ela stepped back, listening. He shifted his angle, struck again. The trunk shuddered. Then came the crack. The great pine shuddered once, twice, then began to lean. Elias jumped back as it fell, the ground trembling when it struck. Snow burst from the branches in a white cloud. For a moment, the forest was silent again. One tree down, he leaned on his axe, chest heaving, watching his breath drift into the morning air. That tree would become walls, shelter, life. He didn't allow himself to feel pride yet. There was too much work ahead. The sky had lightened now, but the cold hadn't eased. A wind crept through the clearing, whispering of storms yet to come. Elias glanced toward the dark line of mountains in the distance. He knew what they held: snow, ice, death for the unprepared. He wiped his hands on his coat and went back to work. By mid-morning, his fingers were numb, his shoulders burning. He had felled 2 more trees and begun stripping their branches. Each swing of the axe sent sharp pain up his arms. Blisters formed, then split, leaving raw skin beneath. He barely noticed. Pain was information, nothing more. He paused only to drink from his canteen and chew on a strip of dried meat. It tasted like leather, but it kept him moving. The silence around him pressed close, broken only by the creak of trees and the occasional distant cry of a bird. This was what survival looked like: no glory, no witness. Just effort stacked upon effort. By midday, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, swallowing the light. The wind sharpened, cutting through his coat like a blade. Snowflakes began to drift down, slow and lazy at first, then faster. Elias looked up at the sky and swore under his breath. He had hoped for another day. He wasn't going to get it. The storm was coming early. He worked faster, desperation lending strength to his tired arms. Another tree fell, then another. He dragged logs into rough lines, marking the shape of what would become his shelter. It was crude, uneven, but it was something. As the first heavy flakes began to fall, he stood in the center of the clearing, breathing hard, hands shaking from cold and effort. The wind howled through the trees now, sharper, angrier. He looked at the half-formed shape of his future shelter and knew one thing with terrifying certainty. If he didn't finish enough before nightfall, the mountain would finish him instead. The snow thickened, the light faded, and with nothing but his axe, his will, and the falling dark, Elias set to work again, because stopping was not an option. The snow came harder as the light faded, thick flakes swirling sideways on the wind. By the time Elias dragged the last felled trunk into position, the ground was already whitening beneath his boots. The storm wasn't waiting for him to be ready. It never did. He wiped his face with the back of his glove and leaned on his axe, lungs burning. His breath steamed in front of him, ragged and uneven. The trees he'd cut lay scattered around the clearing like fallen giants, their raw wood bright against the darkening forest. It wasn't enough, not yet. But it was a beginning. He chose the straightest log and rolled it into place where the first wall would rise. The weight fought him at every inch. His boots slipped, muscles screamed. More than once, he nearly lost control and had to throw himself aside to avoid being crushed. When the log finally settled where he wanted it, he dropped to one knee, chest heaving. The silence pressed in again. No birds, no insects. Just wind and the soft hiss of falling snow. Elias stood slowly and wiped sweat from his eyes. The cold bit instantly into the damp skin. He knew better than to rest too long. Still, his body demanded a moment. He gave it one breath, then another, then forced himself upright again. The axe came up. He began notching the log, carving careful grooves where the next timber would rest. Each swing required precision. Too shallow and the walls would slip. Too deep and the strength would be lost. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but he worked patiently, methodically, as if the rhythm itself kept him alive. By the time the first notch was finished, his fingers were numb. He blew on them, tucked them under his arms, then went back to work. The wind rose as the afternoon wore on. Snow stung his cheeks and clung to his lashes. His breath came in short bursts now, white clouds drifting into the gray sky. He felt small in that vast wilderness, one man against an uncaring world, but he also felt something else, something stubborn and fierce growing in his chest. He would not die here. When the second log was finally set atop the first, he stepped back to look at it. Two timbers stacked together. Not much, but enough to mark the beginning of shelter. Enough to say he was still fighting. He worked until his arms shook too badly to lift the axe. By then, dusk had swallowed the forest, turning the world blue and black. Snow coated the ground in a thick, quiet blanket. His fingers were stiff and clumsy, his breath ragged. He knew better than to keep pushing. Exhaustion was dangerous. Mistakes made in the dark could be fatal. Reluctantly, he set the axe aside and gathered what little he could, branches for a fire. A few armfuls of dry wood he'd stashed earlier. His hands fumbled as he worked, clumsy with cold and fatigue. It took 3 tries before the spark caught and the fire finally came alive. The flames were small, but welcome. He crouched close, letting the heat thaw his fingers inch by inch. Pain returned as sensation crept back into them, sharp and biting. He clenched his jaw and bore it. Pain meant blood still flowed. Pain meant he was still alive. As darkness settled fully over the forest, the storm worsened. Wind drove snow sideways, rattling the branches overhead. The half-built walls offered little protection, but they broke the worst of it. Elise huddled close to the fire, his back to the rising logs, his face to the flames. He ate sparingly, tearing off strips of dried meat and chewing slowly. Each bite felt precious. When he finished, he tucked the rest away carefully. No waste, not here. The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks into the dark. Shadows danced across the trunks around him, long and twisted. His thoughts drifted, pulled back toward memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. Warmer days, voices, laughter, a life that felt impossibly distant now. A gust of wind tore through the clearing, rattling the half-built walls. Elias looked up sharply, heart jumping. Snow swirled through the open gaps, dusting his shoulders and hair. He pulled his coat tighter and shifted closer to the fire. Sleep would be shallow tonight, if it came at all. He lay back on his bed of branches, staring up at the dark sky framed by skeletal limbs. The cold crept in through every seam. His body ached from head to toe. Still, he forced himself to relax, to slow his breathing. Above him, clouds raced across the moon. Below him, the earth felt hard and unyielding. But between the two, there was fire. There was will. And that, for now, was enough. As his eyes finally drifted closed, one thought anchored itself in his mind, steady and unyielding. Tomorrow, the walls would rise higher. Morning came without warmth. It crept in pale and gray, filtering through the gaps in the half-built walls like a hesitant visitor, unsure of its welcome. Elias woke stiff and aching, his breath puffing in small white clouds as he sat up. Every joint protested. Every muscle felt bruised from the inside out. But he was alive, and the fire still smoldered in the pit before him. That alone felt like victory. He fed the embers a few dry twigs and waited as the flames caught, warming his numb hands. Outside, the storm had eased, leaving behind a heavy silence and a thick quilt of snow that swallowed the world. The forest looked frozen in time branches bowed, earth hidden, every sound muffled. Elias rose slowly and stretched, his spine popping in protest. Today had to count. The walls needed height. Shelter needed strength. If another storm came before he finished, the mountain would take him. He stepped outside and surveyed the work ahead. The logs he'd felled yesterday lay half buried in snow, waiting. The half-built walls stood like the ribs of some great beast, unfinished but promising. He picked up his axe and set to work without ceremony. The first task was lifting the next log into place. Alone, it felt impossible. He rolled it toward the wall inch by inch, breath coming in sharp bursts. Each shove burned his shoulders. When the log finally rested against the wall, he took a moment, bent over with his hands on his knees, fighting the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. Not today, he muttered to himself. He cut shallow notches where the log would sit, careful and slow. The blade bit into frozen wood, each strike echoing through the stillness. Snow slid from the branches above, dusting his shoulders and hair. He barely noticed. With a grunt and a surge of effort, he heaved the log upward, guiding it into place. It landed with a dull, satisfying thud. Another course complete. He stepped back and studied the wall. It stood chest-high now, solid and promising. A sense of grim pride stirred in his chest. He wasn't just surviving. He was building something meant to last. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sharp scent of ice. He glanced toward the sky. Dark clouds were gathering again. Time was tightening around him. He worked faster. Hour by hour, the walls climbed. His movements became mechanical: lift, place, notch, repeat. His world narrowed to the rhythm of labor and breath. Hunger gnawed at him, but he ignored it. Hunger could wait. The storm wouldn't. By midday, his hands were raw and bleeding again. Blood darkened the wood where he gripped it. He wrapped them in strips torn from his shirt and kept going. Pain became distant, dulled by exhaustion and purpose. At last, he stepped back and looked up. The walls stood tall enough now to block the worst of the wind. Not high enough for comfort, but high enough to promise survival. Snow gathered against the outer edges, already forming a drift that pressed gently against the logs like a protective blanket. He allowed himself a long breath. The light was fading again. The day had slipped through his fingers faster than he realized. Elias gathered what strength remained and turned to the next task, lifting the ridge beam. It lay nearby, longer and heavier than the others. Alone, it would be nearly impossible, but there was no one else. No help was coming. He studied it, planning every movement. A mistake here could crush him. He rolled the beam closer, then braced one end against the rising wall. Using smaller logs as levers, he inched it upward, straining with everything he had. The wood scraped and groaned. His muscles screamed in protest. Sweat poured down his back despite the cold. The beam slipped once, slamming into the snow with a jolt that sent pain shooting through his arms. He staggered back, breathing hard, heart pounding in his ears. For a long moment, he just stood there, hands on his knees, staring at the ground. He could stop, rest, accept that today was done. But the sky was already dimming. If he didn't raise the beam now, the roof would have to wait. And without a roof, the storm would claim everything. He clenched his jaw and went back to work. With a final, desperate heave, the beam rolled into place atop the walls. It settled with a dull thud that echoed through the clearing. Elias sank to his knees in the snow, chest heaving. His arms trembled uncontrollably, but the beam held. For the first time since arriving in this place, he allowed himself a thin smile. He had a skeleton of a shelter now, something that could become a home. As darkness fell, he gathered branches and dragged them inside the half-built structure, laying them along the base of the walls for insulation. He fed the fire until it glowed bright and steady, casting flickering light across the rough timbers. The wind rose again, whistling through the trees, but it sounded farther away now, less threatening. The walls caught its force. Its fire pushed back the cold. Elias sank down beside it, exhaustion washing over him in heavy waves. He stared at the rising smoke, at the shadows dancing across the half-finished walls, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. Not the fragile kind that flickers and dies at the first hardship, but a harder thing, forged through pain and effort. The kind that says tomorrow is possible. Outside, the storm gathered itself for another assault. Inside, a man sat beside a fire he had built, inside walls he had raised. And for the first time since coming to this wild place, he believed he might endure. The fire burned low as night settled fully over the mountains. Eli sat with his back against the rough wall, knees pulled close, watching the flames dance in the shallow pit he'd carved into the earth. The roof above him creaked softly as the wind pressed against it, testing every joint and seam. Snow whispered against the outer walls, piling higher by the hour. But it held. The cabin held. He breathed slowly, deeply, letting the warmth soak into his bones. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache, yet beneath the pain was something steady, something earned, It's a kind of exhaustion that comes not from defeat, but from effort well spent. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks upward. Shadows leaped across the rough logs, dancing like restless spirits. He watched them in silence, his thoughts drifting without direction for the first time in days. Outside, the wind howled, rising and falling like a living thing circling its prey. But the sound was muffled now. The walls took the brunt of it. The cold no longer clawed at his skin. Elias leaned his head back against the log behind him and closed his eyes. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember warmth, real warmth. A hearth long ago. The sound of another voice. Laughter carried on clean air. It felt distant, almost unreal, like a half-remembered dream. He opened his eyes again, grounding himself in the present. The past had no place here. Out here, memory could weaken a man. What mattered was what stood in front of him. And right now, that was survival. The fire burned low, and he fed it another stick, watching the flames catch and climb. The wood hissed, then settled into a steady glow. The heat pushed back the cold, inch by inch, reclaiming the small space he'd carved from the wilderness. Outside, snow piled higher against the walls. Inside, the air grew warmer, thicker, alive. Elias stretched out on his bed of pine boughs, boots still on, rifle within arm's reach. His eyelids grew heavy, but he fought sleep for a few moments longer, listening. The wind. The crackle of fire. The slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing. Nothing else. No footsteps. No distant howls. No warning sounds in the dark. Just silence and shelter. He thought of the hours spent swinging the axe until his arms shook. The frozen fingers. The hunger. The doubt. Every moment had led to this quiet, fragile safety. It wasn't comfort the way people in warm houses knew it, but it was enough. Outside, the storm raged on, but it no longer owned him. The walls stood firm. The roof held. The fire burned steady. For the first time since stepping into this wild land, Elias allowed himself to believe something simple and powerful. He might survive the winter after all. As sleep finally claimed him, the cabin creaked softly, settling into the earth like something alive finding its place. Snow continued to fall, layering the roof, sealing the structure in white silence. Inside, a lone man slept, wrapped in warmth he had carved from the wilderness with his own hands. The night passed. The storm raged on. And the cabin stood. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Historian Sleepy, where quiet voices, timeless stories, and gentle history guide you into peaceful sleep.